What is going on, gunfighters? A fun episode today. Nothing too deep or philosophical. Just a lighthearted gun chat getting together in this virtual tribe where we talk about gunfighting the right way with Judeo-Christian values and real-world first-hand experience. On that, a podcast hopefully that's family-friendly. Now, not everybody in your family may be into guns, but you can listen to it at least without, by God's grace, a bunch of foul language or using the Lord's name in vain or just nasty references about nasty things or even politics. So let's ecclesia, let's gather together in this virtual tribe and talk about some really cool classic guns still being made today. So, who am I? Who is this person talking to you from across the internet? Why should you listen? First and foremost, I am a Christian, a servant of God, and a follower of Jesus Christ. God has blessed me to do many things in my life, for I could do nothing apart from Him. U.S. Marine Corps combat veteran, did a couple of tours in Iraq. As an assaultman after my combat tours, I was an urban warfare instructor for the Marine Corps under Mojave Viper. Also served in the U.S. Army, both full-time and part-time National Guard. Also did several years in law enforcement, LAPD. I worked regular assignments and more specialized assignments. Been a private contractor for a 3-letter government agency. That's all I'll say about that. Been blessed to be a state rifle and pistol champion and West Coast Regional Rifle Champion. Won more shooting competitions with the talent that God's given me than I can actually remember. Was blessed to be the commander of a tactical team in a large metropolitan area. Our primary job, the reason we primarily existed, was to stop active shooters. I got the opportunity to head up and be the commander of that team. I grew up around guns, hunting and shooting and competing at a very early age. Been blessed to hunt all over this beautiful country, from whitetail on the East Coast to mule deer on the West Coast, and bear and elk and all manner of things. I've even been a professional big game hunter and guide. But again, most importantly, I'm a Christian. And I am your host, Michael Melito. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for listening to all that. Although I don't want to prolong this epilogue, I want to give a caveat as to the categories for today. You would think there'd be a quick, easy definition between like antique, vintage, retro, and classic. But sadly, I found out in doing research for this, there really isn't. Depending on whether you're talking about cars, or clothing, or art, or architecture, they can mean all kinds of different things. So I'm going to define it for this podcast episode. I'm going to define classic as being made from the 1980s. So it has to go back into the 80s. And these are guns so good, they've been made from the 80s until today. Virtually unchanged. Notice I said unchanged. I'm talking about a model. Like the AR-15 is not a model. An AR-15 is a genre, right? There's AR-15s from the Colt 6920 to the original Armalite AR-15. They are nothing really alike. The Daniel Defense Mark 18 is an AR-15. Likewise, a CAR-15 is an AR-15 variant, but vastly different guns. That's not on here. I tried, but I could not find an example of a specific model basically the same of the AR-15 made by the same manufacturer, the same style, being made in the 80s continuously until today. And we'll get into some of the other ones that didn't make the list a little bit later probably, but you've been waiting long enough, so let's get into it. Let's get into the gun Methuselahs, the long-lived lineage guns that have been with us so long they're classics. Classics you could still go to a gun store and order today. Brand new from the factory. I think the king, and this comes from one of the patron suggestions, the Ruger 1022. Been made a long time. How long, you ask? 1965. Before we put a man on the moon, we've been making Ruger 10/22s. And by we, I mean Ruger, not me. I've never worked for Ruger. But the Ruger 10/22 has been coming out since 1965. You can get still that, 10/22 carbine, wood and blued steel basic model. They've been made since the 60s. They're still being made today. Not only they're still being made, they're probably still the number one seller of 10/22s, both of all time. I don't have the numbers to back that up, but I can scarcely imagine a 10/22 single model that has sold more than the Ruger 10/22. Not only in gross, pure, raw numbers, most popular, but even the most popular this year probably sold. I can't think of a model I would bet as being made and sold more even this year than the Ruger 10/22. A true classic. One of my very first firearms. I still have it. I still practice with it. It's sitting beside my bed. They've made some really cool models over the years. The Sporter Deluxe, the International, my favorite, the All-Weather. They even made the kind of Zytel boat paddle stock, which I like in all-weather. The Target models. The Takedown models, which I also have one and really, really like that gun. But they still make that basic carbine, that basic 10/22 carbine, and it's still awesome. And it's been around since the 1960s. That's kind of the epitome. That's got to take the number one mention here. A gun that is awesome, has been around a long time, and continues to be around a long time. Classic, and so good it just won't die. The next one I'm going to mention, before the Patreon mentioned the 10/22, probably would have reigned supreme in this list, and that is what I consider the greatest combat handgun of all time. You longtime listeners will know what I think that is. The Beretta 92. And again, there's been a lot of really cool models. The Centennial, the 92Xs, the 96, the 90-2, which is a completely different gun. But just the Beretta 92 FS is a warhorse that just refuses to die. It has been going strong since the 80s. That basic 92 FS. If you said right now, this is going to be your carry gun, I'd say, okay. If you said you got to go to war with this, which I've been to war with that handgun, I'd say, okay. And this might make a lot of people mad, but if you put them both on the table, not an old beat up one from the 80s, but a new manufactured one, 92 FS, or a new manufactured M17, I'm going to take the M9 Beretta over the M17. I think it's a better, finer, more elegant firearm. It's a classic. It's got a beautiful, beautiful trigger, smooth like butter. A clean, crisp break. A chrome-lined barrel. That open-top design and crazy out-of-the-box accuracy that is almost unrivaled in production guns. It is so good, they are still making it. They are still making the Beretta 92 FS. Have been. Probably will be for a while, and I certainly hope so. It is a classic. That's what I'm talking about. A classic so good. Even with all these plastic fantastics coming out, the new Striker Fire du jour of the day, the one that probably comes out a new one every week. Still, that old warhorse keeps trudging along. It's an awesome gun. That's what I'm talking about. And some of you may be thinking, well, yeah, and the Glock too. And I'd say, nah, wrong answer. Glock doesn't count. Yeah, the Glocks have been around since the 80s. But the Glock Gen 1 and Gen 2 are not the same. As far as I know, the earliest Glocks still being made are the Glock Gen 3s. And they don't make the cut. They're way after the 80s. They're not the same to me. All the Gen 1s I've ever handled, in my opinion, are actually better than the Gen 3s. I like them. I think they have a better trigger. Now, part of that may be because the ones that I've handled have been shot a lot because they're from the 80s. And triggers, like a fine wine, tend to get better with age. The Glock Gen 3 triggers to me don't seem to be as good as the old Gen 1s. And for whatever reason, because the 90s had all kinds of craziness, they also brought in the finger grooves on handguns, which is a fad I'm glad to see die, much like parachute pants. Or the mullet. There's no such thing as a tactical mullet, guys. Sorry. A fad I'm glad to see die, along with finger grooves on handguns. Just horrendous. What a horrible, horrible idea. Anyway, the Glock Gen 3 is the oldest one they still make, has finger grooves. And to me, they don't shoot the same. They're not the same. They don't grip the same as a Glock Gen 1. I would take a Gen 1 or even a Gen 2 over a Gen 3. The Gen 5 is actually closer, I think, in the pin configuration in the frame and in the actual frame styling to the Gen 1 than it is to the Gen 3 or 4. I think the Gen 5 is the best gen, but the Gen 2 and the Gen 1 probably second to that. The ones that came out in the 80s, 90s, the Gen 3, the Gen 4, I don't dig them. Copied a lot now because the patent is expired, but it's just not for me. They don't make the list for me. If they make your list, that's fine, but a Gen 3 came out way after the 80s. And the Gen 1 and the Gen 2, they don't make them anymore. So they're not continuously being made. I know it's great marketing, Glock perfection, but if they're so perfect, why do they have to keep coming out with new gens and stop making the old ones? You can still get basically identical Beretta 92 FS M9. I'm just saying. The next one, second only in combat handguns, I think, to the Beretta 92 FS. The SIG 226. Awesome gun. Been around since the 80s. I know because it went and was the only other handgun that passed the trials with the Beretta 92. Awesome gun. It's one of my daily carry guns. It's probably my go-to carry gun. Now mine, to be fair, is not the same as the old 226. I carry a single action only. I prefer that operating system much better. But again, if you handed me a 226 from the 80s and said, this is your carry gun, I'd say rock on. As long as I don't have to grow a mullet, I'm cool with it. 226 is an awesome gun. The SIG 226, basically exactly the same. Now I know some of the really old German-made ones had a little bit different slides. I'd still say they're the same, and I don't even know when they switched to the full metal slide without the insert. If you're not familiar, if you've never seen a really, really old 226, the original 226 came out in 1984. You could technically, I guess, say that the newer slides are milled, which is better, and the old slides are not. I'd still say it's the same gun, the same as the old 226s, the ones that ran the military trials. I guess you could also throw in the 229. I actually carried a 229. Sadly, it was in 40. That was another fad I'm glad to see die. When I was a police officer, I carried a 229 in 40. It was a good gun other than being in 40 cal. But the Wikipedia says that's been around since 1989, almost as old. They have different importers. I'm not exactly sure how identical the 80s SIG 226s and 229s are to the new ones, and the importers are different because importers switch all the time. It seems like in imported guns, but as far as internal parts and everything go, I think it's the same gun. Again, different manufacturing process for the slides. You want to count that as different? That's fine. I'm going to count the SIG 226. Even the Ruger 1022s have some different ways they're manufactured since the 60s, but I'd call it the same model, the Ruger 1022. I'd call the SIG 226 the same model. I would definitely call the Beretta 92 the same model. But the SIG 226, another awesome gun from the 80s. So cool, it just refuses to be buried. And you think that's old. This next one, not only a classic, an antique, and I didn't even know this. This is another one that came from one of the patrons. The Smith & Wesson Model 10. I just looked it up. You know when that old girl came out? 1899. And I look on Smith & Wesson's website, and it's still there. You can still buy it. Same, even caliber and everything. 38 Special. Now this one's 38 Special Plus P. I doubt the 1899 model could handle Plus P because it wasn't invented. Although it probably could handle it just fine. And You can still get on Smith & Wesson's website. You can still, I guess you can't unless you're an FFL, but you can go and get one brand spanking new. You could theoretically, I guess, dual wield Smith & Wesson Model 10s in 38 Special, one from 1899 and one from 2022. That's pretty cool. Now, I don't know, and I'm not going to spend days researching whether they've been continuously manufactured without a year's break. But a lot of times, manufacturers will tool up their machines or whatever, and they'll do a run of a certain gun, a certain model, and they'll switch the machines and make another model. That's pretty common. But if this has in fact been being made since the 1800s, it is certainly the Methuselah of this list. It is the longest running model. Who knows how many police officers for how many decades in the 20th century carried Smith & Wesson Model 10s. And it's still not the worst choice for a new shooter, for somebody just getting into shooting and they want to learn the fine art of handgun mastery. Smith & Wesson Model 10 is a beautiful, fantastic gun. Also, much newer but still classic, the Smith & Wesson 686. They've been around a long time. Now those you can get in 357 Magnum, a classic. 686 is arguably, and there's a lot of argument there, you could say a lot of other guns, but arguably one of the finest combat revolvers. Yes, combat revolvers, because again, for a big chunk of the 20th century, police officers, all kinds of armed people carried revolvers, and a lot of them carried Smith & Wessons, different models, different makes, but the 686, awesome gun. Another classic, one that I still carry. Now, it's not exactly the same model, modern metallurgy, modern materials, but the Smith & Wesson J-frame. The Smith & Wesson J-frame has been around a long time. According to American Rifleman, 1950. Not nearly as old as 1899, but a long time. The Smith & Wesson J-frame was introduced. And now, mine are modern alloys and much lighter, but you can still, I think, get the classic steel frame, J-frame. Well, I guess reading this, even the air weight, and I have an air weight. It says the air weight, 1952. I mean, that's a classic, and I think of that as like a modern lightweight carry gun. I still a lot of times carry a Smith & Wesson J-frame. Not all the time. It's not my go-to carry gun, but it's like an ultralight running gun. You know, deep concealed carry. It's an awesome, awesome gun. Not only is it so good and so classic it refused to die, it's so good it's still the carry gun of choice for a lot of men. It's not my go-to carry gun, but it is one of the guns I carry a lot. I carry a full-size fighting handgun most of the time when I'm carrying, and I can. Sometimes it's not practical, not feasible. Again, when I go out running, things like that, I'll take the Smith & Wesson J-frame. It is a phenomenal gun. It has been since the 50s, and it's still awesome today. I'm sure there are some minor variants. I've seen some of the older J-frames where the firing pin is on the hammer. Now they're not on the hammer. I'm not exactly sure when that switch was, but I mean, the classic J-frame has been around a long time. I didn't know this till I just did the research for this episode, but the air weight even goes back to the 50s. Talk about a super lightweight, compact carry gun. Awesome. Awesome gun. The fact that it's still made and still being made, and still one of the preeminent go-to snub-nose carry revolvers, is amazing to the just classic nature of that design. And that's what we're talking about today, classics that are still being made. And the J-frame certainly is that. Now, here's one that I want to put on the list. I don't know. I'll let you judge as to whether it should be on there or not. But the Colt 1911. Now, they've gone through a lot of changes over the years, but the Colt Gold Cup, you can still get those. They've been around a long time. They're still a fine target and combat handgun. Another one came out in the 1950s, and you can still get a classic blued Series 70 Colt Gold Cup. Awesome, awesome handgun. Now, I say technically this one might not make the list. You may consider it not as counting because apparently Colt claimed bankruptcy, which was not a surprise to me. I knew that. But apparently they ceased all production for a while. Now, judge for yourself whether that counts or not. It certainly is something to be considered. And a lot of gun companies, they don't continuously make a single model. They'll run up their machines and make a bunch, then assemble them and sell them, and then when they need to, they make another batch of them. But that's a fair point. So maybe it doesn't belong on this list. If you think that it does, the Colt 1911s and some of the ones that have been made a long time may belong on this list. The Colt Gold Cup, the Colt Combat. They are awesome guns. They're still awesome. If I was going back into police work and they said, you know what, you got to carry a Colt Gold Cup, I'd say, awesome. I'd rather carry that than a Glock. It's an awesome, awesome gun. I might change out that rear sight for a more robust Novak style or something. But it's an awesome gun. It's an awesome target gun. It's the Gold Cup. It's an awesome fighting handgun. It's an awesome gun. You could likely get one of those old 1950s Colt Gold Cups and one made on the assembly line this year and swap the parts on them. That's what I'm talking about, and they're still being made. Now, I'm not sure how long they cease production on those with the bankruptcy and everything, but if there's one the 1911 is classic, right? But the old Remington Rand 1911s made for the Army, they're not being made anymore. A lot of companies making like the classic versions of that, but they haven't been making them since the beginning. But the Colt Gold Cup, the Colt Combat, those have been being made for decades and decades. So, if you think that interruption in the production due to bankruptcy counts, then it doesn't belong on the list. If you don't think it counts, then it does belong on the list. Seems like the 50s, they came out with a lot of really cool guns that just hung on. I didn't even know a lot of these went back to the 50s. This is another Patreon shout out. And it's a great gun. The Ruger Single 6, 1953. They still make them today. A lot of really cool variants, more target-oriented ones, super short ones. All different versions, different finishes, different handles. But you can still get a very classic-looking Ruger Single 6. They've been being made since the 1950s. They're a classic. Talk about a good gun for a new shooter to introduce somebody to shooting. Ruger Single 6 is a gun not only would they enjoy learning on, they could pass down to their grandkids. If I had gotten passed down a Ruger Single 6, I'd like to think that I would have treasured that. It was passed down to me from a loved one that was teaching me how to shoot handgun. It's a great gun. It's still being made. One that's not on the list that saddens me. The Remington 870. The new ones are not the same. They're not the same production. They're just not the same gun as, in my opinion, the old Remington 870s. And I really like the old 870 Wingmasters, Police Magnums, Marine Magnums. Exquisite guns. The new ones, no. They're kind of Remington, in my opinion, in 870s in name only. Another one that does not make the list, that originally you would think of as a classic, is the America's Rifleman's Rifle, right? The Winchester Model 70. And the pre-64 Model 70s are awesome. But they switched production. They kept the name the Model 70, but again, it's a Winchester Model 70 in name only. They don't even have the same action. They're not even the same. They went from controlled round feed to push feed, which is about as different as you can get in a bolt action rifle. You know, that's very dramatic. So they've been making the Model 70, but it's not the same Model 70. And even the new ones, thankfully, they went back to the controlled round feed, but there's still some differences in the action. I don't think I could call that the same gun as an old pre-64. I still think they're better now than the push feeds they made for decades. And I would certainly recommend one for a go-to hunting rifle. Like if you want that hunting rifle as an heirloom to pass down for your kid's first hunting rifle or for you to pass down after you're done hunting, I still think the new ones are exquisite guns. I just don't think they're the same Model 70 as the older Model 70s. That's not a continuous model. Again, they call it the Model 70, kind of like they called the new Browning Auto 5 an Auto 5, but it's not the same gun as the original Auto 5s, right? So it's not the same gun. It does not pass the test for me. one that does meet it, and just barely, but hey, it's the 80s, 1987. This model is older than my wife. The Mossberg 500. Classic, awesome, still being made today, meets the criteria. Exquisite handgun. Exquisite for hunting, exquisite for tactical applications, exquisite for military and law enforcement. It is an awesome gun. My one go-to long gun for the apocalypse has recently switched, and it has become a Mossberg 590A1, which is probably not meeting this criteria, but for like an operating system, it's basically the same as a Mossberg 500. And if you gave me a Mossberg 500 and said this is going to be your long gun, I wouldn't cry about it. That's what I'm talking about. It's so good. It's classic. They just can't stop making them. They're awesome guns. Right here on the wiki page, in service 1987 to present. Awesome, awesome, awesome guns. And actually, that's the in-service model. I guess that's when the military started using them. It says here, designed in 1961, the Mossberg 500 was created for hunters. And again, I'd have no problem hunting with this today. Saw one at Walmart last time I was at Walmart. In the case, very affordable, awesome gun. A gun you could kill anything in North America, from a mourning dove to a grizzly bear. They've been being made, I guess, since 1961 designed. They've been being used by the military since at least the 80s. They're an awesome gun. They're still being made. Winchester made some awesome guns. Remington made some awesome guns. Again, I don't think the 870, as much as I love those old guns, I don't think the new ones are the same. And Winchester doesn't make the Model 12 anymore. They make the XSP, which is a good gun, but it's not a classic. The Mossberg 500 is a classic. Beautiful, beautiful gun. In the same way, I don't think the 870s are the same. I don't think the new Remington 700s are the same. Sorry, I just don't think they're the same gun. You might put them on the list if you want to. I love the old classic 700s. Not as much as I like the old classic Model 70s, but hey, they're a good, solid American gun, but I don't think the new ones are the same. We've talked about the Winchester Model 70 and why I don't think it's the same, but here's one. The Savage Model 110. In my opinion, uglier than both the other options, but a great gun. The Savage Model 110. Patented 1963. Still awesome, still great, still accurate, still plenty of hunters out there with them, still taking meat from off the hoof and helping you put it on the table. Still a great gun, still a great model. Savage is still cranking them out, and I think probably have been continuously since the 1960s. It says on Wikipedia, production 1958 to present. Again, the 50s. What was going on in the 50s? Great decade, apparently, for classic firearms. I say 80s are better, but it seems like on this list, a lot of these are from the 50s, and I think that's awesome. At least nobody was wearing mullets in the 50s. And guys, just know that if you want a mullet, if you want to rock a mullet, that's fine. I am not here to judge you on that. I had a rat tail in the 80s, 90s. I think literally almost went down to my waistline. And I rocked parachute pants, lime green, black and white parachute pants. So hideous, I still remember them. So that's fine. And I think the mullets may be coming back in style. I don't know. They certainly have not been continuously in style since the 80s. If you want to rock a mullet, you go ahead. One that almost makes the list, and it saddens me that they stopped production for such a short time, but the Winchester Model 94, classic gun, and that stands for 1894. Produced from 1894 to 2006, and then from 2011 to present. That small little gap, I guess, technically takes it off the list. But talk about a long run. That's awesome. And they were so good in 2011, they brought them back. That says something. Technically, though, doesn't make the list, not continuous production. How about a classic, cool, tactical gun? How about the Ruger Mini 14? Still an awesome gun. Still a capable tactical gun. And although I don't think there's a continuous production of a model of AR-15 that has gone unchanged since the 80s, they have the throwback ones, the retro ones, but they haven't been continually being produced. They're a very new thing. I'm glad they're making them, but I don't think they make the list. However, the Ruger Mini 14, you can still get a classic. I don't know how close they are to the actual originals. They probably updated some manufacturing steps. Maybe you think they don't count, but I think a classic blued steel wood Mini 14 is very similar to an original Mini 14. Can you take the operating rod spring guide from one and put it into one that came out all those years ago? Maybe. Maybe not. I think you probably could. But I think it's probably the same rifle. And if that's true, then this makes the list. And the Ruger Mini 14 is an awesome little carbine. 1973 certainly makes the list as being old enough. And I guess I have to include it even though I don't really like it. And this is going to get some haters. But apparently the Springfield Armory M1A. 1974 to present. And I would have to say the standard version of that, although not the military M14, not even close. In my opinion, if it was designed in 1974, I'm talking the M1A, not the M14. And to present, it makes the list. They're a proven design. They're a good gun. They've been around a long time. So they certainly deserve to make the list. They're a classic. They've been around since the 70s. They're still being made today. So I'm going to put that on the list. The Springfield M1A. Classic. Classic you can still walk into a store and buy today. This one surprises me. It's another classic, and it's from the 50s. I did not think it was that old. I thought it was from the 70s. Maybe that's when it became famous. But the Smith & Wesson Model 29. The 44 Magnum Smith & Wesson wheel gun. The Dirty Harry gun. 1955 to present. Crazy. I had no idea it was that old. Beautiful, classic, awesome gun. Just classic, cool gun. Still being made today. You can still buy one. At least Wikipedia says 1955 to present. Doesn't give any interruptions in the make of them, the production of them. Thinking about that, there's a lot of really good guns that have been made since the 80s, since the 50s, that are still being made today, that are still awesome. The Ruger 1022. The Ruger 1022. Arguably, and at least in my opinion, the best .22 carbine ever. Period. The Beretta 92 FS, still being made. Still, in my opinion, the finest combat handgun. Period. End of sentence. The Mossberg 500, arguably, and in my opinion, the best all-around pump-action shotgun. Period. End of sentence. Classics that just won't die. They're that good. They just won't stop making them for a newer model. Those companies have newer models of newer things, but they still make those because they still sell, because they're still valued, because they're still great guns. There might be some that I forgot. There may be some that you think should be on the list that I didn't think should be. I'd love to know what those are. You can leave them in a comment. You can go to goodshepherdtraining.com. There's a contact link on there. I'd love to get your feedback. If you like this episode, if you like the content, hope you'll consider supporting. Quick, easy way is to leave a review. Another way that you can do that, and the primary way, is to become a patron. A lot of really cool stuff you miss out on if you're not a patron. Our insider chat where we talk about gun stuff all the time. A lot of really cool Patreon-only content on Patreon. Shooting instruction videos, Guns of the Zombie Apocalypse, available only to patrons. Just really cool stuff on there. And I'm humbled and blessed that there are patrons on there that support. And I'm very humbled to be a part of that group. And maybe you want to be part of that group too. Anyway, that's all I'll say about that. As a thanks for listening, the tactical tip of the day. Permethrin. It's a bug repellent. You can get the military surplus stuff. You can find it, I think, at Bass Pro Shop, Walmart, places like that. Permethrin, unlike a lot of like bug repellents off, things like that you spray on you and it lasts for a couple hours, permethrin is meant to be put on clothing and gear, and it lasts for weeks at a time. Recently got here to Florida where my wife's family is, and I'm going to be staying here for a little while, God willing, and nothing unforeseen happens. I'll be here for a little bit, and I've been doing some exploring in the green swamp wilderness. Guess what's all over Florida, especially in the swamp, in the wilderness? Bugs. Bugs are everywhere. Permethrin helps. And unlike a lot of stuff, like I said, you don't have to spray it on every hour or every couple of hours. It lasts for weeks. Putting it on your clothing, and a set of pants you have that you have set aside for going out in the woods, in the wilderness, boots, a field jacket, something like that. Permethrin's pretty good. So, anyway, that's the tactical tip of the day. I don't care about brands or whatever. If it's the same chemical, if it's the same percentage, it should work pretty much the same. But permethrin, it's good stuff. I don't like putting chemicals on me, but I also don't like getting Lyme disease or anything else crazy like that, or getting eaten alive by mosquitoes, literally. So permethrin, it's good stuff, and it lasts a lot longer than most bug repellents. Tactical tip of the day, the tactical verse of the day. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore submit to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners. With that, gunfighters, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.